Is it going? Okay, here we go. All right, so today we're talking about the early Cold War. Uh, Hopefully your midterms today went well. So today, like I said, talking about the early first part of the Cold War up to, we'll talk about Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't know if it'll be later this week or early next week, but we'll kind of cut off there. So 1945 to 1960 is sort of like our boundaries here for today's purposes. Um, Now, I always kind of just start with this because it's lighthearted and it's funny to some extent. Um, but I think the Cold War is kind of like a big myth. I mean, I actually kind of hate that we call it a Cold War, because the sort of typical, you know, um, scenario that history teachers are going to give you is that it's a Cold War because there was no actual, fighting between the Russians and the Americans, and that's the sort of scenario it goes. It was cold because a lot of like the conflict was under the surface, and it was never an actual full-blown war, which is true to some extent. But like, if you look at the sort of number of conflicts that developed during this 45-year period, I think you can really make a strong argument that instead of it should be maybe it's like a hot Cold War, is that like the thinking about the Cold War in that sort of limited sense is really inadequate, because it is. I mean, we're going to see conflicts in the Middle East. We're going to see conflicts in Vietnam and in Korea. We're going to see conflicts in parts of Europe, um, especially Berlin, and I mean, even you could talk about Greece and Turkey, and I mean, then obviously with all this stuff in Cuba. So I would argue that, like, yeah, the Cold War never really manifests itself in like this big full scale ultimate war between the Soviet Unions and America, who was going to be the dominant world power after World War II. In the same sense, it's not just like it's not the sort of limited sense that you hear history teachers normally talk about it. If we look at sort of like the causes of the Cold War, so I think sort of the point to make here is that despite being allies during World War II, and I think that's the important thing to remember, is that um, they were allies in World War II, albeit allies with very different sort of ideologies, and that's what's going to be important as we get out of as we sort of the war winds down, and there's plans being made. Um, that these two countries have very different ideologies, very different ideas of what the world should look like, and so like because of they had so little in common. You have the Soviet Union. It was the goal to sort of spread communism around the world and maintain Soviet control of Eastern Europe, and America's goal sort of ends up being the containment of communism, basically preventing it from spreading, and spreading their own sort of version of what the world like. I mean, it, America was in some ways just was trying to be just as imperialistic as the Soviet Union. Now, I mean, obviously the easy argument is that American imperialism was was a much better form of imperialism for the people. Um, but I think you should understand that, like, I mean, the Soviets would have seen us as imperialists. So if we look at sort of the origins of this, this is the Cold War really starts in the sort of end of World War II, the sort of final stages of it. So as World War II is ending, the British, U.S. and the Soviets are going to hold two meetings, one in Yalta and one in Potsdam, and those two meetings are where we're really truly see like the actual origins of the Cold War, because what's going to happen at Yalta is that the Soviets had promised, Joseph Stalin had promised to both America and the United States to allow Eastern European countries to have free elections. Now, the problem is at Potsdam, Stalin goes back on his promise, and what ends up happening is those free elections that he had promised before never happen. And so, what you see on this map here on the screen is that um, all these lighter pink colors end up, I mean, were controlled by Hitler, and then when the Soviets are pushing the German army back, they basically are transferred from German control to Soviet control, And that really infuriates a lot of Americans. In fact, um, you'll hear American military leaders, when the Russian and American troops meet in Berlin, they'll say, well, we should keep fighting. That essentially, like, the Germans were definitely our enemy, but the Soviets are our enemy too, and that we should just keep this war going to liberate Eastern Europe. And so this is, the fact that elections are never held is really infuriates a lot of Americans, because they thought of this war as like a war for freedom and democracy and self-determination and all that kind of stuff, and it ends up not being because of Stalin's actions. I think this is pretty straightforward. I don't know if I need to talk much about this. I mean, America is democracy and capitalist economy. USSR, the Soviet Union, had a totalitarian government and communist economy, so they're basically polar opposites of each other. Um, we also just kind of want to mention the United Nations becomes a sort of point at which um, had the potential maybe to do a lot of good and prevent conflicts in the world. It's and remember, I'll kind of make a point here to juxtapose this with like the League of Nations. That there's two really important differences that differentiate the League of Nations to the UN. Is that one, the United States joins and really leads the organization, and then two, the UN has an army. But what ends up happening with the United Nations for much of the Cold War is that it just becomes a forum for like the Soviet Union and the U.S. to compete, and so the organization's never really as effective as it probably could have been or should be. Um, what when we talk about, there's a couple terms I guess we'll kind of just throw out here, is that you could talk about um, free elect. I'm sorry, if you talk about the Iron Curtain and satellite states. So first, like, satellite states are countries that were technically independent from the Soviet Union, but um, they were like under Stalin's control. So like they had puppet governments in them, and so they technically had, like, Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia and Hungary are separate from the Soviet Union, but are sort of roughly controlled by the communists and Stalin. And then the Iron Curtain. So like this is a term that Churchill sort of comes up with in one of his speeches after the war. He has this quote where he says that an Iron Curtain had descended upon the ancient capitals of Eastern Europe or something like that, where he's basically, I mean, it's not a real wall. I mean, this isn't, he's not talking about the Berlin Wall. He's not talking about a real wall. It's sort of metaphorical line that's sort of divides Europe between places that were free and places that were not. So that's like an important term to know. If we look at a sort of like a point, and I'm jumping around here a lot because we're kind of going through. There's a lot of things to kind of talk about right when this Cold War started. Um, One of the really sort of hot points of contention, it starts with Berlin, because what's interesting about Berlin, and I really want you to look at this map here, um, is that you'll um, you'll see that like Berlin itself was in the communist controlled East Germany, so in on the eastern portion of it. And so what ends up happening is that you have this little zone of freedom. Like it's bizarre because you have this little zone of freedom in an area that's otherwise controlled by communists. And so what ends up happening is that because West Berlin is this little like bastion of freedom, and you could get flights from West Berlin to France or Britain or United States, that you could use, like a lot of people were using West Berlin as an escape out of Eastern Europe. So you'd have people coming from Czechoslovakia, people coming from Poland, all these different places to try to like escape into West Berlin, and then use West Berlin to get out. And so it becomes really like a hotly debated thing. And Stalin really gets sick of sort of this scenario, and what happens then is that Stalin put a blockade on West Berlin for 11 months, and so he closed off all the roads, he closed off all the rail lines into Western Berlin that cut through like Soviet-controlled territory. And so what ended up happening is like the Berlin airlifts, which is a really famous event, because what happens that um, United States um, and the British are going to fly in basically all the food, supplies, resources that West Berliners needed for roughly a year. And so Stalin's eventually going to cave in and reopen the roads and railroads leading into West Berlin from Western Germany. But it was this really sort of important point in the world where, you know, it was a big propaganda thing. I mean, you could talk about Stalin trying to take people's freedom away, and the British and the United States basically doing everything that they possibly can to um, fly planes basically all day, every day, to make sure that Western Berliners had what they needed and were able to remain free. Um, what's going to change is that after this is that the U.S. is going to start to form its containment policy. And so what ends up being sort of like the hallmark of Cold War policy for America is called containment. And I think like um, they sort of believed that communism was this sort of like virus that spread around the world, and they sort of saw it as such, and they said, well, areas that are already infected, we can't change that, but we can't allow communism to keep spreading. And so in order to sort of kill the virus, you need to, stop it from spreading to new sort of hosts. And that's sort of like what containment ends up becoming. We'll see containment. That's basically like the Korean War's containment policy. Um, what our actions in Cuba is a lot of containment policy. I mean, Vietnam is containment policy. A lot of our actions in the Middle East are containment policy, so that a lot of that is going to tie back to this. With President Truman, the containment policy kind of morphed into this Truman Doctrine. And what containment looked like for Truman was that the U.S. would give support to any country that was fighting off potential communist revolutions or even struggling with communists in its state. And so basically what Truman said is that anyone that may have a problem with communists potentially getting power, the U.S. will go in, will give you as much sort of money and guns that weapons that you need to basically protect your country from falling into the hand of communists. And at least in the 1940s, in early 50s, that looked most like that aid primarily went to Greece and Turkey. Those are two good examples of where Truman Doctrine had the biggest effect. Also during this time, we passed what's called the Marshall Plan, and what this did is the U.S. gave $16 billion to European countries to help rebuild them after World War II. And so I think part of this is economic. Many American companies relied on European consumerism, and so part of this is helping them so that they can help participate in our economic growth. But I also think a lot of this has to do with communism too, because when people were when economies were struggling, people didn't have jobs, economic outlook wasn't good for people. Those were the places that were most vulnerable to having communist revolutions. And so, the United States was fully aware that, if you allowed the European economy to sort of fester and struggle, that communism would have a much better chance of spreading. So like what the United States does is pumps a whole bunch of money into these countries to try to help their recovery as soon as possible. And it actually works wonderfully. I mean, you have that by 1952, Western European economies are flourishing. And so this is a hugely successful thing. And it's actually interesting that with Marshall Plan money, the United States actually offered this to the Soviet Union and the countries in Eastern Europe too, but Stalin refused to take America's money. Um, the next thing is that NATO was formed in 1949. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is NATO, and what NATO is, or sorry, North American Treaty Organization. Um, no, that should be North Atlantic. Um, that what NATO is all about is basically it's collective security. So the way that NATO works is like we're all going to team up. If one of us gets attacked, we're all going to basically team up again, and and all go to war with whoever attacked one of our sort of member nations. So like the big thing to know with NATO is like collective security, and the same thing happens with the Warsaw Pact, um, and that's basically an agreement between the Soviet Union and the satellite countries. So NATO is I mean you can see the map there is the dark blue, um, so and it's expanded since the Cold War. All right, so a couple things are going to happen in 1949 um, is that the Soviets are going to successfully test an atomic bomb, which is really like the main driver of when the second Red Scare starts to pick up, and we'll talk about the Red Scare more tomorrow. But also, the communists take over China. And this sort of alignment with the Soviet Union is maybe a bit overstated because we'll talk about that in the future about how like that sort of alignment between China and the Soviet Union never really fully materializes um, the way that many Americans feared it would right away. But I mean, the big thing here is that now the Soviet Union's have an atomic weapon, so that's it's a somewhat equalizer. Um, and also, um, the most populous country um, in the world is now a communist nation. And so the American public's going to be shocked by the two events. Many believe this sort of as a failure of containment. And then also what happens in sort of immediately following that is that North Korea, which had become communist, um, is that is going to attack South Korea, and the Korean War is going to start. So what we see is that North Korea surprise attacks South Korea, and they almost actually take over the whole Korean peninsula before the UN and other countries arrive to help South Korea. Uh, the United Nations this is an interesting case in Korea because this is like the first example where um, the I don't want to say this like the United Nations is going to act um, as a sort of organization instead of like the United States going in and acting alone. What's interesting though is they actually, when in the process of fighting the Korean War, China was helping the North Koreans quite a bit, and General MacArthur, who was really a famous World War II general, um, wanted the U.S. to invade China and use nuclear weapons against them, and he actually gets removed from his position because he calls out Truman during the war, and Truman removes him for insubordination. Um, what ends up happening by the end of the war is that there's basically they fight for 3 years, and there's this sort of tentative stalemate, uh, starts to stabilize a little bit, and so in 1953 they actually agreed to a ceasefire. And so what's kind of this bizarre thing about the Korean War is that it's actually the Korean War's never ended because they never made a peace treaty to end the war. They just have a ceasefire that's been going ever since 1953. If we look at the sort of significance of the Korean War, the big thing is that the Cold War, this is like the first example where the Cold War goes from economic and political aid to like actual full-blown wars. And so the U.S. and the Soviet Union are really going to begin a huge military buildup. You're going to call, like your book's going to call that the arms race that starts to heat up in the early 1950s after the Soviet Union test their first nuclear weapon. The Cold War is going to expand into Asia, which we're going to see more even when we talk about Vietnam. And America also develops this sort of domino theory, or idea of domino theory, how like um, communism doesn't sort of spread haphazardly. It spreads from one country and then spreads to the next country geographically and so on. So what's going to happen here is that Eisenhower is going to run for president in 1952, and this will be an important political change, which we're going to talk about Eisenhower more in a second here. Stalin also dies right about the same time, so in 1953 Stalin passes away and is replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev is very much this, like his policies at least with regard to how it affected America and Cold War policies were basically the same as Stalin's. Even though that Khrushchev does a lot of like de-Stalinization to the Soviet economy and things like that, it's not for American purposes and American history. There's not sort of tangible difference between the two. It's continued on. He's going to continue strong anti-American policies, propaganda, all that fun stuff. If we look at Eisenhower's Cold War policy, it's based on the idea of massive retaliation and mutually assured destruction. So what that means is like that, like the ideas of that, like if one country knows that you're going to massively retaliate to another country if they do something out of line, is that like you essentially don't have real war, because this, if the Soviets bomb the U.S., then the U.S. will bomb the Soviets to ground and vice versa. So like it's like there won't ever be conflict, because the fear of what would come about is just would prevent people from actually acting on that. Now that doesn't actually end up happening. This Cold War policy doesn't work. And so we'll talk about like in 1960, like JFK makes a lot of modifications to this. But if you look at sort of the differences here between the two, might make sense to kind of go through some of these on your own. The other thing that happens during the 1950s is the arms race is going to begin. So you can sort of see how the arms race develops throughout the 1950s and 60s. We'll talk more about that as how that expands. The other thing that's going to happen with the arms race is that nuclear technology is also going to improve greatly. So like the first nuclear weapons that were used were atomic bombs. And you can sort of see on this chart, this picture here, the little orange mushroom cloud there, that's the size of the atomic weapon that was used on Hiroshima. And then the big orange is like the equivalence of like the first hydrogen bomb that was tested. So you can see the huge difference between the atomic weapons that we used at the end of World War II and the hydrogen bomb. I mean, it's thousands of times stronger. So there's a huge difference between the two of them. So we test ours, and then 1 year later, the Soviets test their first hydrogen bomb. So and this is like when the Cold War, the Red Scare really takes off. Is like with hydrogen weapons, and that both sides had significant numbers of these new weapons pretty quickly. That this Red Scare is really going to take off pretty quickly. And that's problem by a couple of things. Okay, so like one, Soviets developed intercontinental ballistic missiles. They also were the first ones into space. And like we'll talk about these sort of problems with Cold War policies, because I mean the Soviets are gonna. There's a couple of examples in the 50s where Soviets are aggressive, and the United States can't really do anything about it, because we said that like the massive retaliation thing, but like we figure out, well, that's not really legit, because you can't just drop nuclear weapons on people for any reason. The Cold War also is going to spread to the Middle East, so we're going to see that in Iran. With this, basically the CIA goes in and helps overthrow the reigning government, because they're trying to nationalize the oil industry and align Iran with the Soviet Union. So like the CIA goes in, overthrows the government. they install a guy named the Shah, which is going to be really important because we're going to come back to him at the end of the 1970s. I was to see the establishment of Israel after World War II. Um, and so, Israel we're going to talk a lot about with because Israel is going to be like this point of contention for Arab nations in the Middle East. Is that they maybe and maybe rightfully so saw that this was Israelis taking away land from Palestinians, and so there's a lot of conflict between Egypt specifically and Israel during this period. We also can talk about, well, we will come back to this, talk about like development of CIA, KGB, that kind of stuff. And then the other big event for the early Cold War in the 1950s is the U-2 plane, the spy plane incident. Uh, if any of you have seen the movie that came out, I think 2 years ago, it's called Bridge of Spies, or I think was about this incident. Um, so this is actually the last slide. So it's a quick uh, PowerPoint, but I really wanted to just kind of go through some of the big stuff here. Just understand that like the big thing is thinking about containment, thinking about Red Scare stuff, thinking about how the Cold War changes even in the first 15 years with Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine, and then the Eisenhower shifts. And so like it's kind of glossed over a lot of stuff here, but it's important to kind of understand that.